It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, dig into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Aaron Renn, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Life in the Negative World: Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture. Aaron, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, truly my pleasure. This is our first time meeting over Zoom. This is the first time my audience is meeting you. So let's kick this off by having you share a bit of the Aaron Renn origin story, superpowers, special abilities, things we need to remember. What do we need to know about you?
Yeah, so I grew up in rural southern Indiana. Grew up about 4 miles outside of a town of less than 100 people. And then after university, I moved to Chicago, moved to the big city, and started the first of three careers. So I was in management consulting. I spent, 15, 18 years in that field, predominantly with the firm now known as Accenture. And then I did a pivot and started writing about urban policy. Became sort of an urban policy analyst and journalist. Ended up at the Manhattan Institute in New York City, which is a think tank there. And so moved to New York. And people have said, Aaron, you love cities like only somebody, from a town of 50 people can. So that was quite a shift. And then I pivoted in sort of a third career, if you want to call it that, focusing on the future of the evangelical church and especially men's issues. Kind of the gateway to my interest in this was why millions of young men are turning to online influencers, but they're not turning to the church. And so from there, it was kind of my entree into the evangelical space. And then live in back in Indiana, in suburban Indianapolis today. And then religiously, I grew up in a Assemblies of God church, very much in the end times culture war mode in the late 70s and into the 1980s. And then as an adult, I tended to attend kind of urban style Presbyterian churches. So I feel like I have a foot in both camps of kind of that kind of evangelical world there. The one thing I don't have a lot of personal experience with is attending mega churches.
So like, what's the average size church you've been a part of, I guess, throughout all of your years going to church?
Maybe 250, something like that. Hard to say. Some are smaller and some were, as high as like 500, something like that.
And in terms of story behind the book, like, what was the why for you for this project? Was there a question you're trying to answer? Just wanting to respond to things in culture? Like, how'd you get started down this road?
Well, very early when I started my newsletter writing about sort of Christian issues, I wrote a version of this article that laid out my three worlds of evangelicalism framework. This was back in 2017, and it went viral then. It really got a lot of pickup then. And then later, First Things Magazine asked me to update it, and it was published in their February 2022 issue in an article called The Three Worlds of Evangelicalism that may be the most talked about article in the history of First Things Magazine. Really made a huge impact. And so I said, this idea is really resonating with people. So I want to be able to reach a bigger audience than just say a magazine would reach. So I wanted to turn it into a book. And then also, the articles that I'd previously written were very focused on sort of a diagnostic and analysis of the culture and evangelicalism. And I wanted to be able to include more about, okay, what should we do? How should we live? And so that's about three-quarters of my present book, Life in the Negative World: Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture. I guess it's the third incarnation of the thesis, but also contains a lot of material around that's new about how to live in light of it.
And I'd love to have you break down those three worlds of evangelicalism. You got positive, neutral, negative, kind of slash suspicious. I guess timeline wise, like what does that look like, and what were some of the defining moments or key things that marked the three different worlds?
Sure. So we never had a state church like they did in Europe, but for most of our history, we did have a sort of softly institutionalized generic Protestantism as our default national religion. So even as recently as the 1950s, about half of all adults attended church every Sunday. We had prayer and Bible reading in our public schools. We were adding "In God We Trust" to our money, "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. Then in the 1960s, this started to become unwound and Christianity went into decline in America. and its decline is basically continued to the present day. And I divide that period of decline from roughly 1964 to the present into three eras or worlds that I call the positive world, the neutral world, and the negative world. So the positive world goes from 1964 to 1994. And I want to be clear, this is a period of decline for Christianity. All is not going well. Church attendance is down, for example. At the same time, Christianity is still basically viewed positively in society. To be known as a church going man makes you seem like an upstanding member of society, and Christian morality is still the basic moral norms of society. And to go against those could get you in real trouble. About 1994, we hit a tipping point and enter what I call the neutral world, which lasted from 1994 to 2014, in which Christianity is no longer seen positively, but it's not really seen negatively yet either. It's just one more lifestyle choice among many in a sort of pluralistic public square. And Christian morality has a sort of residual effect. Then in 2014, we had a second tipping point and enter what I call the negative world, where, for the first time in the 400-year history of America, official elite culture now views Christianity negatively, or certainly at least skeptically. To be known as a Bible-believing Christian does not help you get a job in the elite domains of society. Christian morality is now expressly repudiated, and in some respects, much of the Christian landscape in America is now seen as the leading threat to the new public moral order. And so this entry into the negative world has been highly dislocating to evangelicals who have not quite figured out how to adapt to the changing times.
And one of the things that was fascinating to me that you pointed out is there are actually presidential scandals that kind of define these different phases. I'd love to hear a little bit about the impact that those made as kind
Sure,
of the timeline progresses.
To kind of illustrate how things changed in these worlds, I used three different presidential sex scandals to illustrate that. If you go back to the positive world, 1987, and this is late in the positive world, this isn't 1967, this is 1987. Colorado Senator Gary Hart was the leading candidate to be the Democratic nominee for president in 1988 when the media reported that he had allegedly been having an affair with a young woman. He actually had to drop out of the race over that. So the idea that you were having an affair simply disqualified you from being president at that era. Fast forward to the neutral world, 1998, the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, where Bill Clinton had been busted having an affair with a White House intern. And Clinton was very badly damaged by this scandal, make no mistake, but he survived it as sort of the Democrats rallied around him and said, well, his personal behavior, however deplorable, does not affect his public performance in office. And then in the negative world, fast forward to October 2016, NBC News is sitting on a tape of Donald Trump on the set of Access Hollywood saying all sorts of crude things about women. And they've been sitting on this tape for months thinking they'll drop it on him as an October surprise and it'll destroy his candidacy. But in retrospect, that was basically a 48-hour blip of a scandal. He went on to win the presidency just a couple weeks later, and hardly anybody even talks about it anymore. And so I think from, Gary Hart to that shows the profound changes in society. And I've said, Donald Trump, the fact that he could become elected president is only possible, in the negative world. I mean, if you think back, we don't even realize that this changed so much. If you go back to the late 80s, early 90s, the gambling business, you either had to go to your local mob bookmaker and place a bet, or you had to fly to Las Vegas and place a bet at a casino that was probably mobbed up. The casino business was considered very shady business to be in. Donald Trump was a casino owner. That was one of his claims to fame. So a lot of things like that, he would not have been considered a viable presidential candidate in that era. And he had talked about running for president for 30 years and just never did it. He had that sort of fake reform party thing that wasn't real. But I think in 2015, he realized something. The world is different today. And a guy like me can win. And he came down that escalator and the rest is history.
At kind of the start of that kind of negative, suspicious era, you talk about how the Great Awakening starts in 2014 with the Trayvon Martin incident. How did that incident, if you will, shift culture forevermore? It seems like things just sprouted up overnight, but that's where it started creeping into culture in a different way.
Yeah, well, a lot of things happened in Obama's second term. Obviously the biggest impact was the Obergefell decision legalizing gay marriage in 2015. The so-called Great Awakening did happen in 2014. I picked that date as the Great Awakening because that's what Matthew Iglesias and some other kind of center-left commentators have said. Trayvon Martin was actually killed in 2012, I believe, but that was a sort of a precursor, if you will, of the BLM movement. And in an era, there's been this research showing that uses of terms like white supremacy and structural racism just soared right around 2014, 2015 in the newspapers. This predated Donald Trump. So it's not a reaction to Donald Trump. Jonathan Haidt, the NYU professor, who wrote The Righteous Mind, he's got a book out now about how smartphones affect teenagers. He said it was 2013 when college campuses started going a little bit crazy. And then, of course, the fact that Donald Trump, ran for president, was elected in 2016. I mean, a lot of things were happening in the culture in that era, and certainly subsequent to it. We've seen the sort of flushing out of the old, I think, moral norms of Christianity. We see that like the fact that like now pot is de facto legal. We see that in the fact that like gambling, sports leagues are now in bed with gambling and it's all on your phones. And it's just a completely different universe, than it would have been 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
And in terms of strategies for the church, or when I say strategies for evangelicals, what shifted? With where we are now in the negative world, why does what we did when we were in more of the positive neutral world, why is that just falling flat and not working anymore? What do we need to see differently?
Yeah, so I identify three major evangelical responses to the period of time covered by the three worlds. And these were developed two in the positive and one in the neutral world. In the positive world, we had the culture war strategy, which is basically the religious right that we know well. I don't think we need to go into that too much. The second was seeker sensitivity, which you can think of as the non-denominational suburban megachurch movement, which is essentially, in many respects, the evangelical mainstream. And then in the neutral world in the 90s, we saw the emergence of a strategy I called cultural engagement, which you can think of as the urban church movement to some extent. And these were all very successful in their eras in a certain sense. For example, in the 70s, we had a big church decline in church attendance that mostly affected the mainline denominations. They had really dominated the Protestant landscape of America, up through the 50s, but they went into decline and they were never able to figure out how to reverse it. Still haven't. But, guys like Bill Hybels at Willow Creek Church in suburban Chicago, Rick Warren at Saddleback Church in Orange County, they figured out how to reach new generations of suburban boomers. And so it really helped keep Christianity alive in America in a way that it sort of didn't stay alive in Europe. But now that we're in this negative world, those strategies don't work quite as well. So for example, the seeker sensitivity strategy originally sort of predicated on the fact that there's this people kind of just had this latent idea that they should be in church, right? Or they were sort of there aren't a lot of people seeking, in a sense right now. Now they are seeking for something, but it's a different sort of thing. They're landing on the online influencers, right? Or they're interested in Enneagram, or they're interested in psychedelic trips. They're not people who were raised in church and now they're having their own kids and they kind of say, oh yeah, we probably should be back in church kind of thing. These are people who literally don't know who Jesus is. I mean, they've heard of Jesus, but they don't know anything at all, about traditional religion. So it puts us in a completely different, I think, cultural milieu.
And I think one of the kind of caricatures or pictures that are painted about Christians these days is we're very anti-intellectual, foolish, whatever you want to say. Speak to evangelicals or Christians more broadly and overcoming our anti-intellectual bent. I mean, I would even say in terms of a lot of pastors that I see being homegrown and coming up in churches, they have, it's very typical for a pastor to not even have any seminary training too. I mean, what the path to being a pastor is vastly different than when I was coming up.
Yeah, I do think it's been widely observed that evangelicalism is kind of anti-intellectual. Mark Knoll, the Notre Dame historian, wrote a book about 30 years ago called "The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind." The scandal being that evangelicals didn't seem to actually have much of a mind. And I think we have to be careful about ascribing too much value to things like intellectual as- uh, pursuits. The Bible says explicitly that God chose the foolish things of the world to confound the things that are wise. What's important is faith, not sophisticated intellectual life. But nevertheless, I think we should be able to have both, right? So we should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And one of the things that happened with Protestantism in America is, it was very stratified, socially stratified. So it was, there were sort of racial barriers, ethnic barriers, socioeconomic stratification. And so what happened is, many of the Protestant elites and Protestant intellectuals were basically in the mainline churches. They were Episcopalian, they were Presbyterian, they were something of that nature. And when those denominations, essentially went into eclipse, and the major institutions of society that had originally been Protestant Christian, like our Ivy League schools, kind of, officially de-Christianized, we were essentially, as evangelicals, left without our intellectual classes and without our intellectual institutions. And so that was dislocating. I mean, if you go back to, again, the 1950s, a guy like Reinhold Niebuhr, major Protestant theologian, he's on the cover of Time magazine. He's considered a major public intellectual in America. Well, there aren't any Reinhold Niebuhrs today. And we're not going to produce any people like that because he was out of a denomination that, ended up getting merged into the, the United Church of Christ. So, we're just not producing people like that today. And so I think that evangelicals need to be able to have a place where there is sort of a respect for the life of the mind and for the arts and for excellence in various categories. Again, I don't think, that needs to devalue people who are not like that, because faithfulness is more important than those other things. But if we are sort of like, a body that needs to have different gifts, then if we're missing certain gifts, we're missing people who've developed certain human potentialities, then that's going to affect the overall performance. And I think it's a problem because we're not capable of being our own intellectual leaders. And that's why, for example, so many evangelicals look to Roman Catholics to basically supply their analysis of the world. And you rarely see that go reverse. You rarely see Catholics say, "Oh, look at this amazing Protestant theologian who's telling me all about the world." And so we have to do a better job of developing our own internal resources there for sure.
Next, I'd love you to speak to kind of the complexity of being a pastor in this space we find ourselves in right now. How is that way more complicated and different than it used to be in many respects?
It's probably always been difficult to be a pastor. I would say that the degree of difficulty dial has been turned up even more. You see the polling about pastoral stress levels from Barna and others, the number of people who are thinking about leaving the ministry, the fact that there's been a kind of drying up of the pipeline, declines in the number of people pursuing MDiv degrees in seminaries. Uh, those are all negative trends. And just look at something like COVID. Um, COVID put these pastors under enormous stress because there were such divisions in society around that. And, no matter what you did, right? If you required masks or if you didn't require masks, if you, had church in person or you didn't have church in person, you were just going to be getting viciously attacked from somebody. And, the church I was attending when I lived in downtown Indianapolis, I'll never forget this. The pastor, this guy was about to retire, and he'd been in ministry for 40 years. As far as I can see, he was like a man at the height of his powers. I mean, nothing unflappable, total command in the pulpit. This is the guy who'd led Mike Pence to Christ in college and all that stuff. And you think he's a master at the height of his powers. And he says one morning, the last 2 years have been the two most difficult years of my entire ministry career. And I'm like, wow, this guy is feeling the heat. It tells you. And so I feel like today, the pressures, the mental and emotional strain that is going to be put on pastors is simply going to be much higher. And, you go back to a guy like Paul, we tend to focus on his physical trials. Oh, he was stoned. He was shipwrecked. He was beaten with rods. But also in Second Corinthians, he talks about the immense mental strain, all the concern for all the churches. Is there anyone who's in sin that I'm not worried about? Or you can think about him in writing Second Timothy when he's in prison. He's been abandoned by most of his friends. He's about to be executed, and yet he's still writing to Timothy. I got to help Timothy. I got to preach the gospel at my trial. I got to do all this stuff. Like this was an incredibly tough guy, physically, mentally, emotionally, and those are the sorts of things that we're going to have to have. And I think that's also going to affect how people structure how they think about going into ministry. If you're going to say I'm going to have 4 kids and I'm going to be dirt poor because that's just the life I've chosen in order to serve the gospel. Well, it's going to be hard for you to maybe tell your congregation something they don't want to hear. If your ability to feed your kids depends on keeping that job, and so maybe there's going to be more bivocational pastors. And I'm not saying that that's that has to be the case. But we got to think, if I'm going into this, am I going to be able to be faithful and handle the pressure? And am I willing to say what the truth is, in despite of whatever pressure comes my way? I think there has to be a certain counting of the cost now in a way that perhaps there wasn't in the past. And so thinking about ways that we can, help strengthen the people in ministry is important. There's probably going to need to be more peer support networks. For example, because it's just going to be it's always been a tough job. I think it's going to be an even tougher job going forward.
I think one thing we can see in culture is that people aren't beating down the door to come inside the church. So, in terms of Christians getting outside the 4 walls, having an influence in all the spheres where they are, just living and doing life, and then kind of opportunities to engage missionally for the average person in the pew outside of church. How might it look different for them to engage in culture in this season, like themselves intentionally, as opposed to expecting people to flock to the building, as it were?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things I'd say is something I alluded to is you just can't assume people know anything at all about Christianity today, because a lot of people, they weren't raised in church. They never went to Sunday school. The culture itself no longer tells Bible stories, and that we don't live in a Bible saturated culture anymore. And so it becomes, when you want to talk about, faith or inviting people to church, they don't even know what it is. And so I think that's one that we have to wrestle with a little bit there. I think it's also going to be important for us to, part of our witness is going to much more be dependent on, I'd say, being visibly distinct from the world in compelling ways. And that was part of the original appeal of the church, in the Roman era. It had a sort of moral authority in the way that they cared for the poor, in the way that they, didn't practice infanticide, in the way that they provided good funerals for people and stuff like that, and kind of the way they conducted their lives. And it's probably not going to look the same, because I would say, I don't think, I think a lot of secular people do not view the church helping the poor as a positive. And you might say, well, how is that possible? But a lot of people today think, well, that's the government's responsibility. And actually, Christians who insist on, providing food to hungry people are actually a barrier between, us getting to the place where actually the government provides people, the support that they need to do. So it's probably going to look differently than it did then. And I think, one of the ways, can we just have healthier family formation? That's one of the things I talk about in the book is, we have plummeting marriage rates, plummeting fertility rates. I mean, imagine being a place where marriage still happens and, it's, families are happy, they're thriving, and there's lots of kids, and it's just a healthy environment. And people are like, wow, I want to get me some of that. And so, again, the way that the church conducted itself in in the New Testament, in the early church, attracted people. And so I think that's one of the things that people need to see, that there's something different about us. And if they don't see that there's something different about us, then we had to be asking ourselves, what kind of, are we really living like an authentically Christian life, given that this world's not, that kind of a place.
Well, and as we begin to wrap up here, I would be not doing a good job if I didn't ask about the attractiveness of Jordan Peterson. And I've read all of Jordan's books, followed a lot of his content. he was completely obscure. Nobody knew who he was hardly not too many years ago. And then you look at the cultural influence this guy has now, it's massive. And a lot of Christians have been attracted to him and would probably listen to Jordan more than they would their own pastor. So why were people so attracted to him?
It's crazy. He's got a book coming out called We Who Wrestle with God. It's his own take on Genesis and Exodus, I believe, certainly at least those two. And he's doing a tour of the country now. Here in Indianapolis, he sold out a 2,500 seat theater. The cheapest seats were over $100. Think about that. You get 2,500 people paying $100 up to several $100 to hear Jordan Peterson preach a sermon on Genesis 12. I mean, at the same time, a lot of churches are struggling to get people in the door. And one of the things that he did, I think there were two things that made him famous. One was when he said he would not comply with this proposed Canadian pronoun law. The other was when he went on the UK's Channel 4 and spent 30 minutes with a very hostile interviewer grilling him while he just calmly held his ground and stated facts about the fact, for example, men and women are different. And here's how they're different. And here's the implications of that. And refusing to apologize, for example, that he had mostly young men watching him. It's a masterclass. If you go to, that's 2018, go to YouTube, Google Jordan Peterson Channel 4, you'll see it. And I like Jordan Peterson because he's speaking truth. He's going counter to the culture, but he was also, winsome, if we might use the word, right? He wasn't trying to pick fights with people. He wasn't throwing bombs. Now, I think post-COVID, he's gone in a different, more political, harder edge direction that I actually don't like as much. I think peak Jordan Peterson was around 2018. But if you watch that and to say what Christian pastor would have gone on that show and behaved and conducted themselves in that way, there's that. And so there's a lot. There's a lot going into these guys. But that's one. The fact that they're sort of boldly saying things that are unpopular but true, while at the same time not being a gratuitous provocateur. I think that's like a needle to thread there. He did a pretty good job of it in that 2018 era.
And we barely scratched the surface. There's so much more we could have talked about from the book. But in terms of, big picture reader's journey with the book, if they take away kind of that core theme, that core message, what's that one thing you hope every reader sees in this book?
I want them to understand that we now live in a different cultural moment in America. I want them to understand the cultural moment and then recognize, as evangelicals, we are a moral minority, not a moral majority. And what are the implications of that? That is, wrestling with that for yourself is what I like to see people do.
And Aaron, in terms of people connecting with you, finding out more about the book, all the things, where do we discover you on the web?
Sure, the book is Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture. Buy it wherever books are sold. And then be sure to sign up for my newsletter at aaronrenn.com, aaronrenn.com. Sign up and all my stuff will land in your inbox and, you'll be able to keep up with all the work that I'm continuing to do on the topic.
And we'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the description and the show notes to any websites mentioned, as well as places where you can pick up your very own copy of Aaron's new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Aaron Renn. Once again, our book today was Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture. And Aaron, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to